Why does the United Nations exist? What is the purpose of the United Nations? Isn't it to prevent such wars? Or if such wars break out, isn't the purpose to stop such wars, mediate, and do peacekeeping? What is the role of the United Nations today? Is it simply just a huge, immense waste of resources and money and time and energy of various nations? We donate a lot of money to the United Nations for its upkeep, for the upkeep of the organization and the salaries of their officials and the trips of their officials and whatnot. We contribute peacekeeping troops to the United Nations that are generally deployed somewhere in Africa. But what about these other conflicts? Why isn't the UN able to do a thing about these conflicts? So why don't we, before we get into the main thing, why don't we take a look at the United Nations and the role that it is supposed to play? And let's also take a look at what it has achieved and what it is not able to achieve right now. So let's take a look at the United Nations and the role it plays. So the UN, what is the purpose and the history? What's the history of the UN? What's the purpose for which this organization was created? So this organization, the United Nations, was established in 1945 following the events of the Second World War. And the fundamental purpose of the United Nations was to prevent future conflicts, and it was to promote international cooperation. And the UN was created as a successor nation to the League of Nations, which was deemed to be super ineffective in preventing the Second World War. And the founding charter of the United Nations, it says that it determines to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And it seeks to establish conditions under which justice and international law can be maintained. And this organization, the UN, exists to fulfill four fundamental objectives that are enshrined in its founding charter. Okay, so first of all, you have maintaining peace and security. Then you have developing friendly relations between nations, promoting international cooperation, and serving as a harmonizing center, a forum for nations to coordinate their actions towards achieving these common goals, these four common goals. Right? So maintaining international peace and security, it's the UN, its responsibility is to take effective collective measures for the prevention of threats to peace, and if such threats to peace do occur, then to remove these threats to peace. The objective is to suppress acts of aggression, and the objective is to bring about peaceful resolution of various disputes in accordance with the principles of justice and international law. And the UN, its objective is to foster diplomatic relations between nations based on respect for equal rights and self-determination of the people of the world. And it's supposed to take steps and measures to strengthen universal peace. And then there is international cooperation. So the UN is supposed to facilitate cooperation and collaboration in solving various international problems, economic problems, social problems, cultural problems, humanitarian issues, and so on. So that is the deal. That is why the UN exists. Now, these are the reasons why the United Nations exists. All of that, what I just said. Now, what has been the UN's role and its function during times when conflicts have erupted? So when conflicts erupt, the UN is supposed to employ various mechanisms to respond to these conflicts. The primary organ of the UN in dealing with conflicts is the UN Security Council. So the UN Security Council bears the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. Now, has it succeeded at all in the past few years, in your living memory? Has the United Nations Security Council succeeded in doing this? It doesn't look like it has. So what are the key wartime functions of the United Nations? First of all, conflict prevention and also early warning of conflicts. So the UN is supposed to use diplomacy, it's supposed to use its good offices, it's supposed to use mediation and other such measures to help nations prevent conflicts, and if conflicts do occur, then to help nations resolve these conflicts peacefully. and make sure that conflicts do not escalate. Then there are peacekeeping operations. So the UN, it deploys various military observers, lightly armed troops, and civilian personnel to monitor ceasefires, to protect civilians, and to support peace processes. Have we seen any evidence of this in recent times? I'm not sure we have, my friends. Then there is peace enforcement. So, under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, the UN Security Council can authorize the use of military force when peaceful measures prove to be inadequate. Well, have we seen any of that in our recent memory, living memory? Then there is humanitarian assistance, humanitarian aid. UN agencies are supposed to provide critical aid to civilians who are affected by conflicts, which includes obviously food and medical care and protection for refugees. Now, is that happening in Africa? I don't think the world is even looking at what's happening in Africa right now. In Sudan, in Somalia, in the Rwanda region, and so many other regions, in the Congo region. Is any of this happening? A little bit may be happening, but I assure you it's not happening the way it's supposed to happen. Right? So these are the wartime functions. Now let's look at past history that may be beyond our living memory. So we've had some successful United Nations military interventions during wartime in the past. One example that is touted is the UN role during the Korean War, which was 1950 to 1953. So during this time, the UN Security Council it authorized military intervention after the conflict erupted, and this was probably one of the first major UN sanctioned military operations. And this intervention by the UN, it successfully prevented the North Korean conquest of the South, and it required a significant amount of international military commitment. So the UN intervention, it essentially led to uh, an outcome that was favorable for the United States, right? And it was unfavorable for North Korea and its benefactors, which were China and the USSR. So the UN intervened successfully in favor of the United States, essentially. Okay, now let's move on to the first Gulf War, 1990, 1991. So Iraq invaded Kuwait. Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait. He was given the go ahead tacitly by the US, and then he was thrown under the bus. So, after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 678, which authorized all necessary means to remove the Iraqi forces from Kuwait. And this led to the successful liberation of Kuwait through Operation Desert Storm, which was led by the United States, but it had this coalition of nations that participated in it. So you could say that the what happened during the first Gulf War was a successful UN military intervention. Then you had Libya 2011. Okay, so the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1973, which established a no-fly zone over Libya, and it again authorized all necessary measures to protect civilians during the Libyan civil war, which was a regime change operation, as we know, right? And this intervention by the UN successfully contributed to the fall of the government of Muammar Gaddafi, and this was a victory for the US. So you can see multiple times, whether it's the Korean War, whether it's the first Gulf War, whether it's Libya, the UN has been able to intervene successfully when when the intervention aligned with the interests of the United States, right? Clearly. Now let's take a look at some failures, some notable failures of the United Nations. So, despite the successes that we highlighted, which all contributed to US victories essentially, or the achievement of US objectives, despite those successes, we have multiple instances, many instances, where the UN has experienced significant failures that have obviously damaged its credibility. And these failures have shown, they have demonstrated the limitations of of international intervention when the so-called global community is not interested, uh, because it doesn't align with the interests of the most important or most powerful nations. So let's take some examples. First of all, we had the Rwanda genocide, 1994, and the driving force behind the Rwanda genocide was the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church has actually apologized eventually for its role in the genocide. So the UN failed to prevent the Rwandan genocide. It failed to stop the genocide once it started. And this is one of the most devastating failures, one could say, in reasonably recent times of the United Nations. So the UN assistance mission for Rwanda was severely constrained by its limited Chapter 6 mandate, which essentially rendered it uh, powerless to intervene militarily. So there were multiple failures at multiple levels. First of all, there was the ignored evidence that genocide was being planned. There was the refusal to authorize the force commander uh, to seize weapons that were being stockpiled for the genocide. Then most peacekeepers were withdrawn after 10 Belgian soldiers were killed, and then the UN abandoned Tutsi refugees in supposed safe zones. So about 1 million people were murdered while UN forces just stood by and essentially just stood by and watched, more or less. And so there was a 1999 UN report which kind of went through what happened, okay? And it called this mission disgraceful, and it acknowledged that the organization, the UN, had systematically failed in preventing the genocide and stopping the genocide. So the UN forces largely stood by as bystanders. They just watched while 1 million people were killed. This terrible, terrible. Then there is Somalia, there is Syria. So the UN has been involved in Somalia, but it's not really achieved anything. The UN backed transitional federal government has been criticized by most observers as being super corrupt and extremely ineffective. It's existing primarily due to donor funding and African Union peacekeepers rather than genuine governance capacity. So that's a failure. Then there is Syria, which happened recently. I mean, the Syrian conflict began as a Western led regime change operation around 2010, more or less, plus or minus a couple of years. And that has devastated the nation. And that's been a long-standing crisis in West Asia, and the UN has been completely unable to address this conflict, right? And this happened because the UN Security Council's permanent members were severely divided about the direction in which the conflict should go. So the UN Security General Antonio Guterres, he described this escalating conflict as a result of chronic collective failure of diplomacy. So essentially, Russia and China wanted a certain set of, they wanted the Syrian conflict to end in a certain way, and the US had a totally different set of objectives for the Syrian conflict. And that's why nothing ever happened. So the Security Council ended up being paralyzed because of various vetoes by permanent members, and this essentially prevented any effective international intervention. And this conflict just went on, and eventually it ended with a successful regime change, and Mr. Assad, the dictator, was overthrown, and a new dictator has been placed in power, a former terrorist with a $10 million bounty on his head. Right. Uh, so now let's take a look at what are the limitations that can be observed when it comes to the United Nations. First of all, there is the veto power paralysis. So there are 5 permanent UN Security Council members, and these nations have been permanent members since the end of the Second World War, 1945, and this represents a completely obsolete, completely outdated power structure of the world. So these are unqualified members who don't even possibly, most of them possibly don't even deserve to be there on the UN Security Council, but they have this veto power, this unqualified veto power, and this often prevents decisive action when their interests conflict. And this has rendered the Security Council ineffective in crisis after crisis. Then there are mandate constraints. So many peacekeeping missions, which are generally deployed in Africa, they operate under a variety of restrictive mandates that limit their ability to use force, even when facing mass atrocities. So the example of Rwanda, which I just mentioned, is a case in point. Then there are resource limitations. The UN says they have insufficient funding, Well, that's a joke essentially, but they say there is insufficient funding and insufficient troop contributions from various nations, and this apparently hampers the effectiveness of missions. Well, that's when you have missions that are deployed in Africa or wherever. But what about the big conflicts where the UN hasn't even been able to enter the conflict to try and prevent the conflict, essentially, right? Excuse me. And then there's the lack of political will. There's a lack of genuine commitment from various member states, which usually, frequently undermines UN operations. Now, let's take a look at the current crisis. Not the Ukraine crisis, which is now old news apparently for many people, but the Israel Iran crisis. What's the UN's role been in this crisis? Right? So, this crisis began, it escalated, it's been happening under the shadows, but it escalated dramatically this month, June 2025, with a direct military confrontation between the two nations. The escalation was started by Israel, which launched strikes on various Iranian uh, facilities, etc. So that's how the escalation began, and then there's been a back and forth of various kinds. So this conflict has exposed the fundamental weaknesses in the UN's capacity to fulfill its primary mandate, its core mandate of maintaining international peace and security. The UN's primary mandate, it has one job essentially, right? To maintain international peace and security. And this it has failed miserably at that when it comes to the Israel-Iran war. So the UN's response to this crisis, it demonstrates a pattern of institutional paralysis. It shows that there is continuing diplomatic ineffectiveness, and there are a variety of structural limitations that kind of echo the UN's failures in previous Middle Eastern conflicts. So, so what are the UN emergency response mechanisms? First of all, uh, you have Security Council meetings, emergency meetings of the UN Security Council. That's the primary response mechanism when something like this happens, some conflict erupts somewhere. So the UN Security Council has convened multiple emergency sessions ever since this conflict began. So this demonstrates that the UN is aware of the crisis, and it's aware of the severity of the crisis, the Israel-Iran issue, right? And I think on June 20, that's a couple of days ago, the Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo uh, warned that the window to prevent a catastrophic escalation and achieve a peaceful resolution to the conflict has not yet closed, which means that the UN can still, at this point in time, intervene and limit the conflict, maybe achieve a peaceful resolution. And she acknowledged that Israel has struck more than 100 sites in Iran, including nuclear facilities. And the UN Secretary General, the boss of Ms. DiCarlo, Mr. Antonio Guterres, he has repeatedly verbally emphasized the gravity of the situation. He has said during emergency meetings that we are not drifting towards crisis, we are racing towards it, right? And he has warned that there are moments when the direction taken will shape not only the fate of nations but the future of humanity, and this is such a moment. So clearly, he's aware of the gravity of the situation. He's aware of the severity of the crisis, and he has called for both parties to give peace a chance. So it's all words thus far. It's all words. Do you understand the difference between words and actions? It's just verbal exhortations, but no actual action. So this is the UN's traditional diplomatic approach with zero practical effect, right? Okay, so now we have Security Council paralysis. I mean, that's why it has not been able to achieve anything thus far during this current conflict. So, the Security Council, it is unable to pass meaningful resolutions. It has tried, apparently. I mean, they've convened multiple secure emergency sessions, but it has been unable to pass any meaningful resolution. Right? This shows the organization's structural limitations and its obsolescence. The UN Security Council is not something that can, in today's day and age, make a difference to the world. It can't. achieve any meaningful uh, action or change on the ground. So Russia and China proposed a resolution which called for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. But this measure faced US opposition. Right? So this was a draft resolution that condemned the attacks on Iran's nuclear sites, and it did not name the US or Israel. But this resolution, it required at least 9 affirmative votes, and it required no vetoes from permanent members of the UN Security Council. So the US has blocked such resolutions. It has consistently opposed resolutions that fail to condemn Hamas or call for the disarmament of Hamas, um, and so on. So the US ambassador has said that the US has been clear that we will never support any measure that fails to condemn Hamas and does not call for Hamas to disarm and leave Gaza. But what does that have to do with the Israel Iran thing and so on, right? So the historical pattern of US vetoes is pretty clear, and the current crisis follows that pattern of US vetoes, which are pertaining to Middle Eastern conflicts. So in March 2024, the US abstained from a UN Security Council resolution which called for a ceasefire in the Israel Palestine conflict. And the US was obviously driven by dissatisfaction of the resolution's failure to condemn Hamas. And this is a pattern that you see over and over again. And this has undermined the UN's capacity to address these Middle East and West Asian crises effectively or at all. At all. So let's do an assessment of UN failures. First of all, there is institutional paralysis. And the UN Secretary General himself, Mr. Guterres, himself has acknowledged that this is the case. He he gave an interview to Al Jazeera in which he said that the UN Security Council is outdated, it is unfair, it's an ineffective system, and the failures are manifold. There's failure to end the conflict in Gaza. There is the failure to end the conflict in Sudan, and the complete inaction of the UN when it comes to Ukraine. All of this is, well, it has completely, totally damaged the UN's credibility, destroyed the UN's credibility, right? So there is institutional paralysis. The Security Council does not correspond to the world of today, and that's what Mr. Guterres has said. It has systematically failed in relation to the capacity to put an end to the most dramatic conflicts. So there is institutional paralysis. And then there are structural limitations. The structure of the UN Security Council, the fact that some members have a veto power. So even if everybody votes for something, one member can prevent a resolution from going through. So that's the veto power paralysis. Unqualified veto power of the 5 permanent Security Council members that is guaranteed to prevent any decisive action from the UN when their interests are in conflict with such action. And the US opposition to resolutions critical of Israel, it effectively blocks a variety of multilateral responses that could have perhaps made a difference. And then there are mandate constraints, which we discussed, which is not that important when it comes to the Israel Iran thing. And there are limited enforcement mechanisms, which is very important. So the UN lacks effective tools to compel compliance with international law when major powers are involved. When small nations are involved, the UN can compel them. But when major powers are involved, the UN just steps aside and watches. It doesn't have any tool to compel compliance with international law when one of the big nations is involved, right? So the UN experts have condemned Israel's attacks on Iranian nuclear sites as flagrant violations of of international law. But this condemnation does not carry any kind of enforcement mechanism, right? We have more failures. We have legal failures, normative failures, violations of international law. So we have seen extensive violations of international law during this conflict, which is pretty short thus far. I mean, imagine attacking nuclear facilities which are under IAEA safeguards. Imagine that. That is a flagrant violation of international law. Then there is the targeting of civilian infrastructure. Then there are extrajudicial killings of Iranian scientists and military commanders, right? So these actions, these attacks, they strike at the core of the international system, which is founded on the respect of the for the sovereign equality of states, the so-called rules-based world order, completely flagrantly violated, right? So the targeting of Iran's nuclear facilities, it's a challenge to the international non-proliferation regime. The U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear sites, they constitute violations, according to legal scholars, of international law as well as the UN Charter. But so they are illegal under international law, and they also potentially violate US domestic law. But does it make any difference? It makes no difference whatsoever. Then there's the failure to prevent escalation. um, so this conflict, the Israel Iran conflict, this existed as the regional proxy warfare. The Houthis were involved, Hamas was involved, Hezbollah was involved, and so on and so forth. So this existed in the form of regional proxy warfare, but now it has escalated to a state on state conflict. And everybody could have seen this coming. Everybody could have seen this coming. So this happened, and the UN was unable to prevent this escalation, right? So this is a fundamental failure of the UN's preventive diplomacy mandate. The UN has early warning systems, right? The UN can do diplomatic interventions, and it did try to do that, but all of these things proved insufficient to prevent the escalation. And now we are in crisis mode. This is a very dangerous, very um, potentially very dangerous conflict that we are witnessing. So the UN has failed. Its mandate has failed. It's an institutional crisis. We are seeing the same patterns of structural weakness from the UN ever since the Cold War has ended. The organization is unable to prevent escalation. It's unable to broker any meaningful ceasefires. It's unable to enforce international law, and this is a continuation now of the failures we have witnessed in Rwanda, in Syria, in Yugoslavia, and various other major crises. The Security Council is paralyzed due to great power competition. It's paralyzed because of the politicization of these issues, right? And whenever there's a critical conflict, the UN is marginalized. Complete systemic failure. And there are peacekeeping limitations and so on. And essentially, at the end of the day, what I would say is that this current crisis, the Israel Iran crisis, has exposed the fundamental obsolescence of the UN. It's an obsolete organization. The UN Security Council is completely obsolete. It's it is fundamentally incompatible with the post 1945 institutional design. That design is fundamentally incompatible with the realities of 21st century geopolitical competition. And that is the reason why India has been repeatedly and consistently calling for a reorganization and reforms of the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council. So today, the UN faces an existential question about its relevance to international peace and security in this new era of renewed great power rivalry and multipolarity, and this complete, very rapid, ongoing global geopolitical realignment. The UN has failed to fulfill its core mandate during this crisis, as we can see in front of our eyes right now. And hopefully, this should constitute a definitive turning point in the UN's role as supposedly the primary institution for global governance and conflict resolution. I think it's high time the UN is reformed and fundamental changes are made that will actually enable it to carry out its stated duties.